the Medical AI Podcast.
Welcome to the Medical AI Podcast with me, Dr. Felix Beecher. Strap in for a 30-minute thrill ride of big ideas. We are all now aware of the outrageous power of large language models, or LLMs, such as Grok, Gemini and ChatGTP. And ever since they exploded onto the scene in late 2022, there has been a scramble to implement these into healthcare products. However, there is a big problem. They can hallucinate like Timothy Leary on a cocktail of peyote, LSD and ayahuasca. Except that these hallucinations can look very convincing. In the context of healthcare, of course, that's a problem. Well, to discuss this very important and fascinating area is Dr. Vlad Panin, CEO of iFrame. Vlad, a huge welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Got to ask you, Vlad, have you ever done peyote, LSD and ayahuasca?
Never.
Never? Are you sure? I'm not sure. You can tell us. I'm not sure whether I believe that denial.
The only time I've tried that is before my surgery, but I think it was legal.
Excellent, good for you. Well, you're not especially prone to hallucinations, apparently, but could you introduce yourself and explain a little bit about your company and how it relates to this question of hallucinations?
Thank you, sure. So, personally, about me, I was maybe one of the most interesting projects in my life was United Nations-backed eHealth project, connecting over 35 million patients and basically 17,000 pharmacies, healthcare providers in the country, and that project still works. I was part of executive team there, and in this company specifically, what we do is we are building a 12 million context window medical model that is capable not to tell users something that they don't want to hear in terms of information from the sources they want to use. So our main task in this current company is basically make LLM work with a very specific targeted data and do not provide anything besides these defined data. Very briefly, that's what we do.
Okay, good. Look, we'll come on to your company and how it relates to this area a little later, but let's go back to first principles. In general, could you tell us how LLMs are used in healthcare currently?
Sure. At this point, there are multiple types of LLMs. So first is audio to text, which is very well known from products like Dragon and others. And basically, they are used by medical professionals to automate notes. There is some risk of hallucinations there, but not as large as in diagnostic support, where medical doctors rely on not actually LLMs, multimodal AIs, to help them with diagnosis, analyzing MRI scans, etc. I think that that's the most dangerous part in terms of application. And the area where we work is LLM in its very typical classic use case. Basically, we are converting chats, charts, and other information from the medical history to the administratively useful documents, which is primarily for medical reimbursement, for insurances. Mm-hmm. Here, we also have a slight danger in terms of hallucinations. But yeah, I can tell about this a little bit more in our further discussion.
Sure. Okay. Well, look, why don't you give us a specific use case example, or maybe 2 or 3 examples, to give us a flavor of how LLMs are being implemented currently in healthcare?
So far, there is a product like Suki, for example, what they do, it's a very simple. You record something from the conversation. Doctor records something from the conversation with a patient, and these kind of applications, they transcribe dialogue into the notes. So I'll mention the problem here right away, which is you never know who is talking actually. Sometimes people read a lot of smart information online, and sometimes patient can sound, or mother or father or some another person who is with the patient can sound pretty convincing to LLM in terms of diagnosis, etc. And when LLM is trying to build some note from this conversation, from the audio, there is a huge risk that LLM will capture some ideas from the person that doesn't have actually any medical experience or education. I think that would be a huge risk for this specific application. And in terms of MRIs and radiology, there is very interesting use case we work with a Japanese company that they are actually manufacturing MRIs, and they try to implement this LLM, multimodal LLM models to help with diagnosis identification. And I think while it is really helpful and it can reduce some time for medical professionals, I think that it's too early. It's the way better to rely on this model to, let's say, as some advisor, but definitely I would not trust it as the same as doctor. So probably these two are really very dangerous. In administration, we have another use case where LLMs.
But let me but before we go on to example number 2, I think let me just make the comment that I think what you've done there is describe it in quite a sophisticated way, because on the one hand, the dangers that there currently may be in kind of multi systems that integrate MRI scans with other kinds of information, they may be dangerous right now, but they may in the future, in the near future, be extremely powerful, right?
Absolutely.
Take us, if you would, into use case number 2.
So these are basically administrative use cases, and I really like them, and that's why our company is in that space. It's because it's such a messed up in the first place that it's pretty much okay if LLM is doing some. The cost of mistake is not as huge. So the use case is basically converting charts, converting medical history into something that is the billing department can use for reimbursement. So now we don't talk about actual danger for health, but there is another problem that is in the US, or I'm pretty sure in Europe as well, recognized as financial toxicity when we talk about treatment of these, like some specific patient. And these LLMs, of course, can contribute this problem if they don't function properly, which means if they basically generate some hallucinations or they are taking into consideration some notes that are not relevant to the case, such case can be easily denied, which will apply to some delays in treatment. And that's another huge danger actually for the patient.
I see. Okay. Use case number 3, Vlad, what would that be?
So the use case number 3 is actually what I mentioned earlier. It's a different type of AI, which is image recognition AI. And here it's less about AI and more about how we treat these systems. And what I mean by that, it's very often I see when users, especially medical professionals, they see this magic when some computer can tell them diagnosis and in 80% it's correct. There is this phenomenon when doctors starting to basically rely on these ideas in a daily work. And I think that's the huge danger, because in the first place, these systems were not trained to produce correct diagnoses. They were basically trained to help doctor to maybe take some facts into consideration, maybe extract some data that would be relevant for the case. But because they are so convincing, when like the interface of communication with AI is so human-like, there is a huge difference of huge danger of misunderstanding here. So I think that's a huge psychological issue that we have when we communicate with LLMs.
Yes, LLMs tend to not be very coy about the limits of their knowledge in general, right? They have this overconfidence. Why don't we go back a couple of steps even further? Let's think about what hallucinations actually are in this context. Could you define them in terms of LLMs?
Indeed. My book actually is part of curriculum in a few universities for PhD students, so I can talk about this forever. Briefly, what I can say, to make LLM work and to tell us something in a human way, we have to use a huge amount of data. So where to get these data? The answer is everywhere we can. And that's the problem for healthcare. If we talk about marketing, it's useful to hear from LLM or to see how it generates very nice text with the keywords that we asked it, etc. In healthcare, because LLM was trained on a huge amount of data from the random sources, when it tries to predict next word, next token, it often uses nonsense. For example, recommendations from Stack Overflow or other like forums or open chats or whatever was used for to train that LLM. And it contributes to these hallucinations a lot. So from the LLM's perspective, it does not hallucinate at all. It just tries to predict the next word correctly. From the perspective of professional in some field, it's indeed hallucinating LSD kind of creatures, So I think that the huge danger is at this point we should treat LLM as a tool, but definitely not as equal specialist. So maybe I would be more than happy to describe what we can do basically to eliminate this. But if you have other questions, I'll be more than happy to answer.
Okay, but obviously that's very important. But before we go on to that, why don't we talk a little bit more about what the dangers are of hallucinations with respect to healthcare? What kind of things can go wrong? What are the worst case scenarios here?
I think it seems like the huge danger comes from LLM, but I think that there is another problem, is reliance on LLM to do some very specific job. And what I mean by that, because LLM is so convincing, at some point we can have a use case where LLM basically provided 90% of all data we asked it correctly. And because it's so convincing and because we rely on this output, we add this to our pipeline, basically treatment guidelines, etc. So I think that's a huge danger, because it's very easy for LLM to be convincing and still be wrong. And it's very obvious to everyone right now. However, I see that there are so many products have been created within these 2 years that hospitals already use. And the interesting thing here is the adoption curve. So first, doctors tend to not trust that at all. There was this narrative, we are not there yet for a while, and still there, which is fair. However, there is the point where it turns in a different way, where doctors start using it and they start relying on it too much. And I think that having this healthy balance in the usage of LLM, that's the most critical part, and that's what can prevent us from disasters. How to completely prevent LLM from hallucination? It's agentic AI only, and it's pretty much impossible to achieve with just like one shot output. So yeah, that would be my very brief answer.
Have there been real world cases where life and death cases, even where things have gone wrong because of doctors or LLMs being embedded in systems and the outputs being taken too seriously?
So we do have lots of cases where it actually helped a lot.
Mm-hmm.
However, because of I'm in the US and we have lots of stuff with liability if we'll mention some very specific cases. So I'll try to be as specific, but in the same way, like as blurred as I can. So there is a use case where LLM is used as a part of a kind of like assistant for pre and post surgery pipeline. So what I mean by that, there is practice where doctors are preparing so-called red books for patients, describing what they should do, what they should not do before surgery, after surgery. And if the patient uses this kind of AI that is trained to be kind of like assistant, advising some things to do or not to do before surgery, there might be a misunderstanding. One of them is, for example, there is a patient with diabetes, and the LLM might hallucinate in recommendation when exactly the patient should not take pills for like his basically chronic disease. In this red book, it's highly likely, it's like 100% that there will be statement that pills should not be taken the day of surgery. That's obvious because like that's important for anesthesia. However, if the question that this patient will ask will be like, should I take my pills before surgery? LLM briefly might say, no, you shouldn't. So if it's like 3 to 5 days before surgery, that might be actually deadly for the patient. And I think that it's very important, that's super critical to be specific, to use very, very, very specific AI, fine-tuned AI based on real data to this specific use cases, and not allow patients, actually prohibit them of using general AIs like ChatGPT, etc. for these use cases. I know there is a possibility right now to upload this PDF to some notebook or whatever, and it will create some summaries. But that's one of the use cases when it can be really deadly for the patient. Not only it will prevent the patient from the surgery, it might kill him before the surgery even starts. So yeah, I would encourage people to use these products, not judging them by features, but by like what kind of data they were trained for, which specific use cases they were prepared actually to work. So yeah, that would be my main message.
So just on that point, if we take Grok or ChatGPT, now these are not specifically trained for any kind of medical purpose whatsoever. However, they are trained on a vast amount of data, which includes a lot of medical information. So I guess there's a risk-benefit balance, isn't there? I mean, in many cases, these general LLMs might be extremely helpful for people at home who are curious about what symptoms they might be having.
Absolutely. I think that it will be not really honest from my end to recommend them. Why? Because while these LLMs, they are very sophisticated, they are very accurate. The problem is data, which these companies utilize to train the model. They were very, very wide. And I personally don't trust, especially black boxes, like you mentioned, like OpenAI and others. I would trust Llama more. It's a little bit less sophisticated, it's less accurate, but you can fine-tune it and get some result. But at least you understand what data, which kind of like data sets they've used. In terms of OpenAI and others, they sound great, but I just have no idea what was used to train them. So it's highly likely that they will generate some nonsense in the moment when you really need to have very clear and verified data. So yeah, that's my personal opinion. but I think that's a huge danger to using them.
Now, there are specific techniques which are used to not avoid, but minimize the possibility of hallucinations for LLMs. Could you just take us through what those kind of techniques are, how they work, and what the results are?
Data sets. Thank you. That's a great question. So my very brief answer is data sets. Mm-hmm. It's very critical to work with hospitals, to work with healthcare providers, private practice, etc., to work with actually administration and insurance companies. They have a lot of data that can be helpful to cross-reference some dependencies between diseases, treatments, etc. And these data, it's basically the most critical part of the training. Another thing is the context window. That's very important to have the model that is capable to cross-reference these, let's say, calculate these cross-referencing at the moment of response. Why I highlight this problem? Because right now, most of the products that are using AIs, they use OpenAI or Gemini with a context window limit 2 million tokens. What it means that electronic healthcare record system cannot be, let's say, fitted to this LLM in one shot. Mm-hmm. And it contributes to misunderstanding where the model is trying to find semantic similarities in the data to leverage RAG or other, improvements of the output. But in reality, it just creates more and more hallucinations because of that. It's only the only way to actually isolate this problem is enabling model to see, if we can say that, to basically read the entire medical history in one shot. And for that, we have to have this capability of 5 to 7 million tokens at least to make that possible. So, yeah.
Okay, well, why don't we turn to iFrame, which is your company, as an example of how LLMs can be deployed in the healthcare sphere. Could you just take us through briefly how that works and what the importance of it is?
In our specific case, what we do, we trained LLM to analyze 12 million token context window. It will be soon published on AWS Bedrock. So it uses their secure protocols, which is another problem with application. However, the main usage example in our case is converting medical charts into so-called ICD-10, CPT, HCPC, basically diagnosis and procedures, codes for diagnosis and procedures. So these codes can be used for correct insurance claim generation. That's the only purpose of our AI, which sounds very simple, but it's really, really complex task to do. That's very brief answer. I would be more than happy to talk more about that, but yeah. Well, if you have more interest,
the reason I think I like this example is because it's a use case that I would never have thought of. You know, I mean, there are lots and lots of software applications in healthcare where people are using LLMs to, for example, make sense of medical notes or dictations in the radiography booth or something like that. You know, those are fairly standard use cases. But something like using it for making sense of medical codes, I think it speaks to the flexibility with which they can be used to address medical problems. Do you see what I mean? Is that fair?
Absolutely. If you don't mind to make this podcast a little bit spicy, we can talk about United Health Group, about United Health Group and what happened actually with this.
You're talking about assassination now, I believe. Is that true? Or?
Assassination as well, but it's not only about that. The thing that a lot of people don't talk about and the media don't talk about is about the United Health Group and Optum specifically. What they do, they basically monopolize the market by market consolidation. And the problem here is in the first quarter of 2024, which was also kind of like just disinformation past media, there was a huge blackout, especially in the United States system, where every single healthcare provider that works with United Health Group, they were not able to get reimbursement for 3 months, for 1 to 3 months. And the reason for that is there are 300 people in Vietnam, India, other countries that are using US patients' private data to convert charts into medical codes, because it is basically the load that exists in the system, it's impossible to process in the US. So as the result, what we have, it's not only United Health Group paid over 20 million ransom to these hackers who stole the data, and till this day nobody knows where they are, including some social security numbers, other things. But that's not our topic. Coming back to medical coding, that happened specifically because this medical coding was outsourced by huge monopolies that controls 1/3 of the market, $4.7 trillion market, outsourcing these processes to foreign countries. I think that that's a huge danger. That's why we actually started this company. And another thing is not only basically large companies like the one I mentioned. I'm trying to put myself out of trouble, let's say, making it not too spicy. The thing is that right now we have another situation where on the events we hear a lot about we are not there yet in terms of application of AI in medical space. However, specifically this company is using AI, and we know because they basically are buying startups. They are consolidating right now AI startup market, and they use AI to identify codes, wrong codes, or codes without with no support or very weak support in terms of documentation, and they are sending letters to healthcare providers to charge them back. And we know situations when healthcare insurance asks for $2 million, $3 million charge back, just because their AI identified something that doctor did not include in the chart, and they ask doctors to go through the 7 years of medical history of every patient they saw, and that's what actually happens right now on the market, and that's what we fix with medical coding automation.
Okay, well, Vlad, I speak to lots of companies, and when it comes to LLMs in healthcare, there seems to be quite a lot of uncertainty and hesitation. People are obviously aware of their transformative potential, but are somewhat reluctant to kind of go full steam ahead with deploying LLMs in healthcare software because of, I think probably the biggest objection is hallucinations. As this problem is worked on and addressed, how do you see LLMs being deployed, or the role of LLMs changing over time in healthcare?
Thank you. That's a great question. And I think it's not only the question about the technology, but also how we'll organize this transition. What I mean by that, it is clear that potentially of LLM is basically replace doctor at some point, or replace healthcare administration at some point. And I hear this a lot about the security of jobs, etc. However, it is critical to use LLM to make that possible. So right now we're at the point where it's all about the marketing, and that's the biggest danger here, because LLM is not ready yet to help to replace the doctor, but it's positioned on the market as something that is capable of doing that.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge danger. We should be very conscious about that. In terms of addressing it, as I mentioned, we have technology in place. However, it's the data that will make LLM really accurate, and at some point will be able to help to assist with the medical tasks. So yeah, I'm also very skeptical about replacing the healthcare providers at this point with just pure LLM. So that's my message to healthcare administrators and owners of hospitals. But also, I would encourage doctors to use it and contribute to LLM in a maybe smart way, like investment. You can actually, if the legislation allows you to collect some data, maybe masked so you don't disclose patient data, but use it to train your own LLM. So you can basically create your clone as a radiologist, as oncologist, other profession. And it's highly likely that these large corporations will need your license to use it, to utilize it in their product. So that might be extension and some like hedging risks strategy for doctors that are now afraid of using AI for many reasons, but including this complete replacement of the job position. So that would be my recommendation.
Very interesting. Well, look, Vlad, it's a really fascinating subject. Before I let you go, though, I am going to ask you what your favourite current example of a medical AI system is, apart, of course, from your own. What would you say to that?
I see how I already mentioned that we work with a very interesting company that they are building MRIs. And while I don't trust this automatic diagnosis, I see that it's a huge potential in using AI for recommendations for mobile devices in radiology. And what I mean by that, for example, Africa, they have a huge problem in rural areas and even in the United States, to be fair. With access to sophisticated radiology, especially it's about pregnant women, and having AI that does not actually generate output as diagnosis, but helps unprofessional person to conduct some kind of imaging. I think that it's very low risk and a very high reward there. So that would be my favorite.
I think that's a fantastic example. And Vlad, let me just say thank you very much for coming on. It's been a brilliant discussion. Go away and do some ayahuasca, and then you'll know what it's like to be an LLM on a bad day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vlad. I've really enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Cheers, Vlad. Good luck. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening. Ping me on LinkedIn if you have any ideas on new subjects or guests.